ERF projects and establishing carbon trading and risk fire management capability for the firm. He currently co-chairs the Savanna Fire Management Industry Working Group, which is also endorsed by the Carbon Market Institute, along with Kristina. So please join me in welcoming our four fantastic presenters. And I'll hand over now to Jarrad, Ben and Kristina, who will jointly present the first presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Jan. I'll just show you my face for a minute before I screen share, which I will do right now. It should be that one. Is that working?
Yes, it looks good, Ben.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks for the intro. My name's Ben. I work for Central Land Council. I'll be presenting with Kristina and Jarrad on extending the Savanna burning method to the frequently burned areas of the Tanami and southern Kimberley region. It's changing. Good. So this is a collaborative project with the 10 Deserts project. Here's a bit of a rundown on 10 Deserts. It's a project to support Indigenous land management throughout the rangelands and deserts of Australia, particularly South Australia, Northern Territory and Western Australia. There are four main strategies as part of the program. Fire management would fit into any of these in Indigenous context, but today we'll be talking about carbon and co-benefits, which is one of the key activities of the project. So this is a collaboration between 10 Deserts and land management organisations in the desert. I'm going to talk about the on-ground capacity and gaps in capacity. Chris will talk about the same in the KLC context, and Jarrad will talk about the research program itself. As with all Indigenous land management projects, and particularly fire projects, it's about supporting Indigenous people on country. So everything that we do has a foundation of supporting people that live on the country to increase their capacity to be on the country and manage it and improve their lives as a result of that. Fire management is my passion, and it's a key part of the CLC's land management program. It's not just about the fire management, it's about the culture that goes with fire management, and particularly in the context of the remote deserts of Central Australia, accessing country to do fire management, but also to get the other benefits of people getting out to remote country that they don't otherwise have access to. We have a fire program. In the region that we're talking about, there are 3 ranger groups and 1 Indigenous protected area. And these also have governance structures to support them. So the ranger groups have their traditional owner ranger advisory committees, which guide the work of the ranger groups on the ground. IPA committees obviously guide the IPA work plans and any initiatives that come through the IPAs. And there's also the Walu committee. Walu is the Warlpiri word for fire, and that committee guides broad-scale fire management across the whole Tanami region. It's a fairly key component of this project. These committees all guide fire management. The fire management that we do has an impact on fires in the desert, but it's a very broad area, and there's always more that can be done. And the groups in the Tanami have seen the benefits of fire management and carbon projects in Northern Australia, and would always have an interest in seeing the benefits of those programs flowing a bit further south. So as I said, there's a North Tanami RPA. The main community there is Lajamano. They have the North Tanami Ranger Group. There's the Munguru Rangers in Dargaragu, which is a bit north of the project area, but have traditional ownership over parts of the North Tanami. And then there's Murrawari and Yankel Rangers in Tennant Creek, who do a lot of firework, being in a more urban environment. These rangers have constant exposure to fire management, and through the CLC, annual program of training, fire management planning, on-ground burning, and reporting. The ranger groups are very important for for traditional owners, and they have the cultural license to operate on country. And over the the 10 to 15 years that these ranger groups have been operating, have really developed the trust from the TOs that they're going to manage fire and other things in the ways that the traditional owners want. So CLC is supporting this collaboration on the ground. We already have a small carbon project in the north of the CLC region that's above the 600 mil rainfall line. People have seen that project, and whilst it hasn't been running for very long, there is an income stream there that allows traditional owners to be on country, pass on knowledge, have choices about how they spend their own money on infrastructure and how they run their project, and also the capacity building that comes through that in terms of governance, fire training, and other means of making themselves independent. So this project would look at applying that model elsewhere. It's a 2-year collaborative project, which the 10 Deserts project ends in 2023. There are a few, the other initiative that the ranger groups have taken on is fixed wing aerial burning, and that sort of brings me on to some of the gaps that need to be addressed. I've spoken well of the fire management program here, but there are gaps, and obviously an area the size of the Tanami, Jarrad will put up a map in a minute, but it's a big area with 3 ranger groups and almost 0 access via road. To implement a broad-scale fire management program would take a large increase in effort and resourcing, extra people on the ground. We've seen that through some of the work that Hannah Cliff at 10 Deserts has done with one case study, that whilst we've had ongoing fire management in the Tanami for 10, 15 years now, and this has been with helicopters and regular on-ground trips, that it's only made quite a small difference to the regime of large summer wildfires. So there needs to be a big increase in the amount of on-ground effort, and we've noticed in the past few years as well that the timing required to do burning at an appropriate time, that is shortening with summers being longer and hotter, and then having to get fires in before the weather starts to warm up again in July. So that's the CLC context on the ground. I'm just going to hand over to Chris now for a slide and close this screen share and hand over to Chris, who has the presentation. Over to you.
Oh, you can leave it up. You can leave it up, same slide anyway.
Okay, I'll just change the slides when Jarrad says to.
Oh, that's good. That was it.
Sorry, that was it?
Yep.
Is that good?
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Ben, and really just complementing all of those points from a Kimberley perspective as well. So Jarrad will put up that map in terms of the rainfall band there between the 400, 500 and the current 600 mil isohyde, where the method at the moment cuts off. That band sort of goes all across, especially northwestern Australia, and in the Kimberley is particularly relevant for a number of groups with very large native title determinations across the border from the Tanami NT and then all the way to the coast south of Broome. So those groups initially were involved in a workshop here at the KLC. This is probably about 1.5 years ago now. So that's Juraballin, which is the Barragoo IPA and Barragoo Rangers, Nurra, so Yananajara Aboriginal Corporation, Nurra Rangers, Niganamangala with Walalaku Aboriginal Corporation, and then Garrajari all the way on the coast, on the western end of that area. What's particularly interesting and relevant here is that 600 mil rainfall line where the method currently ends, that splits a number of those native title determinations, which means that at the moment the areas that are eligible north of that line are actually too small for those projects to be viable. So an extension all of a sudden means that there's a bigger area that's contiguous, and it becomes a little more viable to run those as a carbon project. And that is particularly relevant as well with in interplay with another issue about the method, which is that one of the main vegetation types in the northwest, so the far western Kimberley, is currently not included, which is the pindan vegetation, so acacia shrubland on those red sands. So there's a bit of an interplay and a kind of combined opportunity for some of those groups to derive the benefits that are associated not just with carbon but with enabling those 5 projects. And Ben's already mentioned a lot of the benefits are not carbon credit focused. They're focused on the social and cultural benefits that groups are able to derive once they are resourced to run fire operations over their native title areas. So that means getting people out there. That means, you know, telling the stories and following the song lines and looking after significant places in a traditional way and with the right people. And so that opportunity to fund that through carbon and make that self-sustaining is something that the groups over in the Kimberley, so over the border from the CLC areas that Ben just talked about, are also really keen on. There's been training and operations going on, and those groups are doing what they can with the resources that are available, but it's that dependency on grants to do it every year that will be reflected in it not being as landscape scale and as high impact as we would like it to be. So so that's why that carbon opportunity over here as well is a really good one. And it's worth noting the collaboration between those groups. So we're talking about individual projects and we're talking about individual native title areas, but especially in that desert belt, there's already such strong collaboration and working together going on between those groups that will be really beneficial to run those projects going forward, because there's not, the fact that there's a boundary on the map doesn't mean that that's where it stops. Groups have worked really well together through the 10 Deserts program as well, and starting to upscale their operations as much as possible at the moment, and in training and building that capacity to run such projects. And as Ben said, it's about getting carbon ready. So hopefully once we get there with the method, people have had the skills and experience and the training to run it and move away from that sort of annual grant chasing to a self-sustaining model. And on that note, Jarrad might want to talk a little bit about what that actually means and the technical context for it. And he'll show you that map that Ben and I have talked about.
Cheers. You're okay to keep driving the slide, Ben?
Yep.
Okay, cheers. Thank you. So yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Jen. To start just by acknowledging the traditional owners whose country we're all meeting on today. I'm on Darwin country in the Blue Mountains, but yeah, I'd like to just acknowledge the TAs from all around Australia where people are dialing in from, and to the organisers as well. Huge effort. So I'll just skim over quite quickly this program. So hopefully you can all see on the map just an indicative area that we're working in. So this area is just like a band of country immediate below the 600 mils. It's an area that has frequent fire, similar in frequency to the low rainfall zone. It's dominated by late dry season fire. Roughly 90% of fire in that area is late. So although it is a large area, it's 130, 140,000 square k's or so, as a proportion of the whole desert, it's quite small, roughly 5%. But from our calculations, it represents roughly 50% of all abatement opportunities in the desert are concentrated just in this area. And that's because it's burning frequently, it's getting the bottom end of the monsoon, so the systems are sort of working the same as further to the north. Probably just one point though, this doesn't mean that the rest of the desert fire management isn't important. It is. It's just that carbon's not going to be able to provide the resources to do fire management. So we're looking at other things there. I think next slide. Thanks, Ben. So while we're doing this, first point is just that there isn't any data below 600 mils. So these are just preliminary estimates, and they could go up or they could go down, but we're being quite conservative. It's recognised that abatement per unit area is actually quite low. It's on the lower end of the spectrum, but it is comparable to a lot of other places in the low rainfall zone. But what is a big advantage in this region is that it's just a very large continuous area of Indigenous owned land managed by a relatively few number of groups. So there's a good economies of scale. So if this part of the world had been dissected by 50 pastoral leases, then this wouldn't work. But because it is, 4, 5 or 6 ranger groups managing large tracts, it all kind of just falls into place due to that sort of economies of scale and be able to work together. So our current estimates are around 80,000 tonnes per year on average of emissions avoidance. So although in a national context or global context, that's not a lot, for the people of the Northern Desert, it actually adds up to quite a lot of money when that gets converted into today's prices. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. We think it's worth pursuing. Next, thanks, Ben. So I wasn't not going to go into much technical detail because we could get bogged down for ages, but I'll just touch on the rainfall boundary because this comes up quite a lot. People say, well, there is a 600 mil boundary there now, nothing's changed, it's there for a reason. Now, what are you guys doing? So my first point really is just that in the paper written by Peter, Jeremy and Cameron in 2014, which is what was used to describe the current boundary, statistically, there wasn't a lot of difference between 500 mil and 600. So you could already argue that the case to go into at least 500 has already been made. There's also no hard and fast rule that says you have to use 100 mil rainfall bands to describe a boundary, because ultimately the driver is fire frequency and the ability to improve on that. So particularly if we just went with a 500 mil boundary, it could slice off some of that frequently burnt country in the Tanami. So we might have to look at maybe using something a little bit different, but all this sort of stuff will be worked through. And also it's the same team from DCBR who wrote the 2014 paper. They're involved in this project, leading the research. So collectively, we all feel that modification of the boundary would be doable and warranted. And yeah, we'll see how that goes over the next 18 months. Next slide. Thanks, Ben. So what we're just starting now, it's a 2-year project. There'll be the veg mapping. There are some different veg types below 600 mil. Then there's a collaborative project with traditional owners and the researchers, do all that sort of work that a lot of other groups have been involved in over the years, weighing the grass and running out tape measures to measure patchiness, burning efficiency. So essentially we're doing the same that what has already been done in the savannas further to the north. There's probably 2 key elements. There's traditional owner involvement in the actual field research itself. But in addition to that, what Ben and Chris were talking about is also that carbon project readiness with funding for training, equipment, getting out experience, consultation, all those things. So at the moment, there has been significant funding already committed. So the project is starting. We're still short some funds, particularly next financial year. And also we just got, I think we all recognise that there's more to this than just collecting data or TOs wanting to be involved in the marketplace. There is this ongoing work with just promotion and communication. So when there are changes to the method, this part of the world gets included. Next, thanks, Ben. So this is just acknowledging all the partners and supporters of the 10 Desert Project. In addition, just in regards to this carbon and co-benefit bit of work, there are additional supporters, and those arrangements are just being finalised now. So if this presentation was given in about a month's time, there'll be another slide with all the additional supporters and partners of this particular project that we haven't got there yet. Contracts are being worked through as we speak. I think that's it. Ben, next last slide. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ben, Jarrad and Chris for that presentation. Just a reminder, there's a chat function down the bottom, so feel free to put in your questions for the presenters into the chat. We'll move straight on to the presentation from Kristina and Gary, and we'll do questions for both presentations at the end of this next presentation. So I'll hand over now to Chris and to Gary to start their presentation. Thanks, guys.
Excellent. Thanks, Jen. And Gary, just making sure you're there as well.
Thanks, Jen. Sorry, Kristina, I think I missed that, but anyway, thanks for kicking off the presentation.
Excellent. All right. Yeah, so this is really to give everyone an update on the industry's involvement in developing the Savanna fire management methods under the ERF. So Gary and myself chairing the working group and running you through a bit of the context today. We'll have questions at the end, and really keen to have a bit of a discussion, especially including people that haven't been involved in the last few months as this has been going on, because the intention is really to make sure that we as an industry have a bit of a united point of view, I suppose, working with the regulator in particular and the department on moving this forward. So a bit of context. So the 2018 Savanna methods, most of you will know, there's the emissions avoidance method, which is the one that's sort of the well-known avoiding emissions from greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere from burning. In 2018, there was a second method added that combines that with what's called sequestration. And for those that maybe haven't been engaging with that so much, that's actually about accounting for the carbon that's stored in organic matter. So there's a second method that combines those. In particular, that method, there's a few deficiencies with it that have so far prevented adoption by the industry. So if you look at Savanna burning projects that are currently registered, the very, very vast majority is just emissions avoidance projects. And that's despite quite a significant opportunity that comes with sequestration in terms of increased potential credit earned by just accounting for another carbon pool in there. So number of deficiencies that we've been trying to work with the department and the regulator over the last couple of years to address, to ensure that they could be rectified. And there's some fair amount of momentum happening, but then the method development responsibility late last year was moved from the department to the Clean Energy Regulator. And with that, there was a prioritisation of a number of methods that the regulator had been given instructions to work on, which doesn't include Savanna burning at this point. So we'll get into some detail on what these are. That was sort of the catalyst for all of us to say, well, we've sort of been talking about this definitely through the Indigenous industry and through ISIN and with ALFA and KLC, having done a lot of work on this over the past couple of years. Then some of the big corporates that are involved lobbying separately. But this was really the catalyst to say, look, let's get together as in industry and establish a bit of a working group. So we've got a bit of a united front and can push this forward in that context. these are the methods there at the bottom that were prioritised by the Minister. So that's Angus Taylor there. That was giving those instructions to the regulator in terms of the methods that are going to be the priorities for the next year. So you can see this was as of December last year, soil carbon, carbon capture, use and storage, biomethane or green gas, which is all connected to his gas-led recovery, plantation forestry, and then blue carbon. So that's the methods that are prioritised, which obviously exclude Savanna burning at this point, but we all know that the opportunity and the importance of the method and those updated methods from 2018, including sequestration, are so significant that we as an industry really want to ensure we keep pushing for that and don't drop it while it's not on the prioritisation list. So we'll talk later about what that means in the meantime, and then also making sure that it will get into the next round of priorities once the regulator gets their new instructions later this year. So as I mentioned, that means the working group was established a few months ago now. Secretariat support's provided by Corporate Carbon, so Gary's office and his team there, co-chaired by Gary and myself at the moment, and really keen to be very inclusive and open to all industry participants. So please let us know if you do want to be included in the meetings where we go through all these matters and decide how to go forward on them. And very keen to have people involved from across the spectrum, including producers and anyone else that's got an interest in this method being further developed and pushed ahead, given all the benefits that come with it. One thing to note is that the mandate of the working group is really focused on the technical issues and sort of dealing with the method as from a scientific and operational point of view, which are the areas where there's really broad consensus across the industry that we need to push those forward. Now, native title matters, which we know there's a few issues that especially the land councils across the north have been working towards over the past couple of years as well. So we will progress those from an Indigenous carbon industry perspective with ICEN, with the land councils and with the relevant producers, separate to this working group. So that work will not stop. It's not going to be sucked up into this working group. It will go on, but this working group is really the technical bits where it's very straightforward that all of the industry agrees that we need to move forward. What have we done so far? So we were trying to get the method onto the priority list, of course, late last year. We've met with both the department and the regulator and corresponded with the Minister's office. Obviously, the method didn't get onto the priority list, but yeah, I should mention that both the department and the regulator were very receptive to those conversations and trying to work out how we push this forward. Some of you will be intimately familiar with those sort of top issues that we're pushing for, and these are really the requested method fixes. So that's a little bit irrespective of some of the method extensions that are also going on, but this is really about what we've currently got, what needs to happen in order for the industry to adopt those methods. Most of those points have been around basically since the methods came out. And please, if there's any questions at the end, I'm more than happy to go into some more detail. So there's a couple of scientific, technical issues with the method that we're looking to have fixed. So that includes what seem to be a couple of errors in what are the L values, so fuel accumulation rates, effectively the variables that are in the method to calculate out your different quantities there. Then the exclusion of Pindan, which I touched on before from a southwest Kimberley perspective, the Dampier Peninsula, the fact that there's a vegetation type that's not included, which means those areas effectively aren't feasible to be included because that vegetation is not eligible. And then there's a number of policy fixes. that includes both CFI Act amendments, including, and this is something that many of you would have talked about, the fact that at the moment a relinquishment obligation, so if there's for some reason a reversal in your sequestered carbon, you might have to return your credits. At the moment, that obligation to return credits or pay back extends not just to the sequestration credits, but also to emissions avoidance credits, and a couple of other areas there to address, including transferring between the two methods. So that's in terms of the Act, and then in terms of the method itself, at the moment there's a 5-year window which basically limits that unless you transition by 2023, you don't get a new crediting period. So we're really conscious of the fact that the method at the moment obviously isn't attractive for industry to adopt. It's taking time to fix that. It's also taking time to run through the appropriate consultations, in particular from an Indigenous industry perspective, of course. And we started those a couple of years ago, but they keep going on, and because of those uncertainties with the method, that 5-year transition window is becoming really quite short, because we've effectively got 2 years left and no one's jumped over yet. So that's that one there. There used to be an ability to have a period between when your baseline ends and when you effectively start the project to build that capacity and make sure that your planning is in order, and then transition to start the project. That's one that has several advantages, and we've seen that now with COVID-related constraints on consultations, for example, that often you end up with a baseline period that you planned for, but then because everything else is taking a bit longer, by the time you get to registration, that baseline shifts a year because you've lost that amount of time. So going back to having a mechanism where you can say the baseline period ends at this point, and then you've got a bit of time to line up proper consultation will be really important, and will also mitigate to a certain extent those pushes for conditional registrations before consent, because you'll actually have time to get proper free, prior, informed consent from everyone involved. Management of prescribed weeds, that's currently in there. There's a few issues around that that are making it relatively unrealistic in the seasonal environment that we're all working in up in the Savanna, given the wet and dry season dynamics there and how the timelines are required for eliminating weeds. And then the technical guidance document, which is a new thing that was introduced in the new methods. The idea was that it's something to make easier changes to the method, but it also means at the moment that changes can be made at any time and then will apply to existing projects, which obviously means that it's really hard for groups to manage that risk because you can never foresee what the change might be. So it's about managing that, addressing that uncertainty, and then talking about longer maximum and subsequent crediting periods, because as we all know, Savanna burning never becomes self-fulfilling. You have to keep doing it every year and every year and every year. And if you stop, well, you know, we go back to the situation that we had 20, 30, 50 years ago, where we weren't able to do that anymore. So that's the fixes that we're talking about in terms of the existing method. Most of this I've covered, but this is really just to show that this is going back a few years. Some of the science is there. The Pindan science was done 2018. From 2019 onwards, there's research going on that others have touched on over the past couple of years into living biomass and standing dead wood, so different, again, different carbon pools. Feasibility is going on, feasibility studies going on through 10 deserts in particular, in terms of extending the method south that we talked about. And then that big change from the responsibility for dealing with all of that and implementing all of that from the department to the regulator late last year. So that's the context that we're working with. Before we get into discussing what we do with that and where we want to go as an industry, Really important, I think, to highlight the key stakeholders in this in particular, and in terms of involvement going forward. Really keen to see proponents involved, because it's the Indigenous groups, it's you guys on the ground that know how this works and how it translates and what it means. That's going to be really crucial for making any changes, any fixes, any new methods appropriate and usable for people on the ground. Obviously, that's also where that desire for risk mitigation will come from, and actually understanding, you know, what does it mean if we commit to 25 years at least of a project? How do we mitigate that risk? We need to make sure we've got continued accessibility to a good reporting platform. So that'll be a key proponent concern in terms of a move to full CAM, which we talked about yesterday a little bit. And then, of course, the Indigenous perspective in particular through ISIN. Clean Energy Regulator, as I've just touched on, obviously one of the very crucial players in this, having a 1-year time frame to come up with new methods as per the priority list. CDU, of course, and DCBR, the Centre for Bushfire Research, obviously really important to have involved, given all the great research and science that's going on there to feed into all of this. Then the inventory team and their collaboration with CSIRO in terms of the move to full CAM, which was detailed yesterday by a couple of the presentations. And then lastly, CMI, as I said, this is all under the ultimate oversight of the Carbon Market Institute, representing the broader industry. What we might do now, and I'll hand over to Gary for this, is actually talk through what does this mean and how do we go forward, and then really keen to hear from everyone here as well how you think we should continue to have that really concerted industry push to make these methods viable and exciting and appropriate for people on the ground, so that we can take this forward. Gary.
Okay, thanks, Kristina. In kicking off, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. I think, like this slide, we're just kind of trying to bring together, so like Kristina's done a fantastic job outlining the problems and, you know, the kind of framework that we've tried to put together to address them. And this slide, like, you know, really our thoughts about, you know, how to take the process forward, and certainly like kind of looking for industry input and feedback on that. So just kind of the like maybe 4 main points that we've identified there. And the first one is just continuing with the process to advocate for the fixes that Kristina outlined. Now, in meeting with the regulator, they've been very open to kind of listening to us and hearing what's required. They've probably been less responsive about committing to do anything about it. And I think they, you know, quite understandably, they've got some, they've made some quite ambitious commitments to dealing with the current method priorities. And I don't think they even know, like, at this stage, what resources are available to deal with other methods. So from an industry point of view, it's probably important that we try to keep like our list of fixes or the things that we see that are pretty urgent in dealing with the current method in front of them, and continue to advocate that these issues get dealt with. It's not completely obvious to us at this stage whether that would be would actually result in the regulator applying resources to deal with them. But I think it's, you know, it is a responsibility of us to kind of continue to ask and to continue to push those issues. Then maybe moving on to the second point, I guess this one is, you know, like reasonably obvious in that priority list is meant to be dealt with within a 12-month period by the regulator, which means that every 12 months there's a kind of a new list of method priorities that are put in front of the regulator for the next year. And, you know, although it was disappointing that the Savanna method didn't make it on this year's list of priorities. It just means that we need to continue to advocate to try get it on the list for next year. Just some kind of, maybe our thoughts on what we could do better, how we could be more effective in advocating that is potentially bringing in some of the industry partners, also some of the broader partners within the economy outside of the Savanna fire management industry. So they were kind of thinking about the buyers of the credits and maybe also some of the kind of industry partners that are associated with Savanna projects, but aren't running them as a kind of core business or aren't the landholders themselves. So we think if we can kind of try and broaden that, the number of parties advocating for Savanna fire management methods to be dealt with, it's more likely to be successful. But apart from that, it's not obvious to us why the method didn't make it on the priority list. Like, we think there's a really strong case to deal with this method. It's creating a lot of abatement, and it's got the potential to create a whole lot more if the fixes are dealt with. So we think our arguments are really very strong, and there's a good case to continue pushing them. Then maybe moving on to the third point. Sorry. This is more about dealing with, what would a new method look like? And here we're kind of thinking about not just the fixes, but also the expansion of the sequestration method to include the carbon pools that are currently not included in that method. So here we're thinking about standing dead biomass and living biomass. And obviously, we understand from the science that would have quite a significant uplift in the sequestration that's achieved through the method. Now, at the time that the 2018 method was made, there was maybe a little bit of controversy around the science, or the science hadn't been completely developed. But since then, the science has progressed a whole lot, especially thanks to the CDU, and almost to the extent that the inventory team is in the process of adopting these expanded list of carbon pools into the national inventory. So we think that the technical case for expanding the methods is very strong. And it's about, well, how is that done? Now, as an industry, we could kind of sit and wait for the method to be prioritized and maybe deal with it then. But, an alternative approach would be to try to be more proactive about it and engaging maybe some of the critical partners around that, maybe excluding the regulator at this stage because it's not on their priority list, but trying to engage the other partners, the other stakeholders, and saying, well, can we start working on this kind of new expanded method in the meantime, so that when it does get prioritized, that we're not kind of starting from scratch, that we've almost got, in an ideal world, an industry consensus or stakeholder consensus about what that new method would look like, maybe even to the point where at least some of the technical drafting is done, and then we're kind of sitting down with the regulator on the front foot saying, well, this is what we want, this is what we've been through with some of the other stakeholders, and let's start at a million miles an hour so that we can get this thing resolved as quick as possible. So that would involve a process of engagement with those other stakeholders, and ideally getting into the technicalities of how that new method would look like. As Kristina kind of well identified previously, we're already talking about FullCam as the calculation engine that would drive that method with expanded carbon pools. So then it would be, well, how do we write that up into a new method? And absolutely, there's good existing vegetation methods that rely on FullCam. So there's a good precedent. There's methods that we can draw on to kind of pull that all together. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a particular long or difficult piece of work. And we would be encouraging industry. We hope industry adopts the position that that's something that we can get going with straight away. And then maybe just the final one is in tackling that it maybe also gives us an opportunity to get on the front foot about how we would like the use of full cam to look in being adopted by Savanna fire management projects. So certainly, industry seems very happy with SavBud. It's a fantastic tool, relatively simple to use, and the goal would be to have a front end that looks like that. But also maybe like thinking that we could be a little bit more ambitious, and what else, what expanded functionality could we see or could potentially be adopted into like a kind of full cam driven calculation engine. And then maybe we're kind of thinking about things like the ability to better forecast abatements maybe halfway through a fire season, or the ability to kind of feed in certain scenarios or fire projections to model like what the abatement to be achieved at any end of a fire season would look like. So there may be some advantages about trying to kind of engage earlier on that kind of stuff. Maybe just to finish off with, absolutely, we encouraging as much participation in the working group as possible, and maybe even to the extent of trying to engage some of those kind of corporates that I mentioned before, so the end users of the commodity that we're producing, the carbon credits, or also maybe some of the companies that are indirectly associated or involved with projects already. So it'll be fantastic to see the working group expanded to some extent. So I think that brings it to the end. Like, obviously, as Kristina said, like, happy to take questions or get feedback as much as possible. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gary and Chris, for a really thorough overview of where the industry's issues are. Like you said, the industry sort of framework for how to address some of those issues and some ways forward as well. I'm not sure if we've got a bit of extra time and what time will be brought back into the main session. So we can certainly use this opportunity now to ask some questions of any of the presenters in this session, Ben, Jarrad, Kristina or Gary. I haven't seen anything come through on the chat, but also feel free to just turn your video and mic on if there's any questions that you'd like to ask. While we wait, I guess I'll ask one. Is there any feel from, I guess, the industry to date, but maybe also from the regulator, what the kind of preference is, whether it's, trying to fix the method we've got on the table now, whether it's working on bringing in these new things and including living biomass through full cam? Is there kind of a sense of what the preference is from both that industry and I guess the regulator side?
All right, I'll comment. Sorry, I thought Gary was about to start. I think obviously the regulator is in a bit of a tricky position, I suppose, with the method not currently being a priority. So there's certainly been, which has been appreciated, a bit of an offer to be pragmatic on things that are easy to fix, but at the same time, that's really hard to see whether and to what extent that's going to become reality, given the fact that it's not on the priority list. So from that perspective, it certainly sounds more like a push towards waiting until it's on there and then doing it properly, with whatever the new carbon pools would be. From an industry perspective, I think it's a little bit the other way around, because we don't know when and to what extent it will make that list and what that would mean, and also just conscious of the fact that obviously this has been going for the best part of 2, almost 3 years now, in terms of trying to address some of these issues. There's groups that are really keen to transition, but sort of being held back by some of these matters, some of which should be relatively straightforward to address, including some of the technical bits. So I think from an industry perspective, it's certainly trying to fix what we've got, so then at least we can run with that, given it's, you know, it's there, it's almost there, and it's got significant uplift potential, which I think sometimes is overlooked in trying to, you know, develop new methods from scratch. Is the fact that with this method that's already in existence, by making those little fixes that will facilitate adoption by industry, the uplift in terms of carbon credit generation and so carbon abatement is actually significant.
Maybe just to add, just like a quick point to what Kristina said. You know, in meeting with the regulator, they definitely seem well-intentioned, and I think they would like to look at the fixes, but the sense kind of I got is that it's very likely that they're going to be overwhelmed with other things. So they might, like, we might well see like the kind of a disconnect between their good intentions and their ability to deliver when they're so busy with other things. Certainly their preference would be to do everything at once. I think they would have been much happier if it had been on the priority list and they could have solved it in one go.
I'll unmute myself. Thank you for that, guys. There's a few questions that have come through on the chat. First one from Tegan to Kristina. Could you expand on how the Pindan vegetation relates to the 500mm method extension?
Yep, sure. So mainly through the fact that it's similar areas. Pindan also extends down, obviously, below that rainfall line, but it's similar native title areas. So there's groups that currently are prevented from registering even small projects by the exclusion of Pindan. Those groups also would benefit from the extension of the method. So ideally they'd get both, but the method extension south for some of them would at least give them one way to run a viable project pending Pindan. For others, it hinges on Pindan, but there's a couple of groups in particular where both of those constraints, one through a large amount of their country not being eligible, and the other one from that artificial line that sort of cuts through the native title area, mean that that those projects aren't currently viable. So it's a geographic linkage there.
Thanks, Chris. Question from Sam Johnson to, I guess, anyone on the speakers panel. Does anyone know what the uplift would be for the sequestration method and to any of these new pools that are yet to come online?
Kristina, do you want to try that, or do you like me to give it a go?
Oh, feel free to give it a go. I can talk to it too.
Okay. So I think, Sam, probably to start with a little bit of a cop-out, it kind of depends on where you are and vegetation types, but probably on a whole, like maybe the average across like most of the top end would be when the new sequestration method was delivered, it's probably achieved maybe about a 30 to 40% uplift in total abatement achieved by projects. So, you know, so some things went forward. So, you know, including the sequestration pool, there was an uplift, but then some of the other things took it back a bit. So, you know, the changes in the L values, for example. So maybe about a 40% uplift. And if the other pools get included, so standing bed, dead, and living biomass, you're probably looking at several multiples of that. So that uplift could be like much larger than that. So we kind of think at this stage is really just a down payment on the movement to sequestration, and the real benefits are in the carbon pools that haven't been included yet, but that, you know, that looks like the science is now there that they should be and can be included.
Yeah, and maybe to complement that, I think the existing method already for some groups, and as Gary says, it really depends, but for some groups that's a doubling, possibly even tripling possible through that method, and again depends on where you are and the kind of vegetation types, but really significant for some particular projects in terms of transitioning. What that also means is that there's potential projects that are currently not registered that only become viable once that method is actually feasible to adopt, because they just wouldn't make sense just as emissions avoidance projects. So a lot of the time that extra uplift, whether you compare it to what a current project would be under emissions avoidance only, or whether it's just from zero to the new method, a lot of the time that makes the difference between whether you would even go and register that project or not. So there's sort of there's the uplift on existing projects, which depends on what they are, but sometimes can be, sort of in the multiples. But then there's also projects that otherwise just wouldn't come into existence that are depending on that method.
Thanks, Chris and Gary. Another one for Kristina. In your talk on the method fixes section, you mentioned that under the CFI Act, that the payback applies for emissions avoidance as well as sequestration methods. Can you just clarify that?
Yeah, so that's how it's drafted at the moment, which, as I understand, was never the intent, but it's still a bit of a headache to fix. So at the moment, the relinquishment obligation, if incurred, does apply to all of your credits. So, and maybe the context to that is that emissions avoidance credits are calculated separately to sequestration credits, and then the sum of the two gives you your credits for a given year, and obviously there's different calculation methods involved for the two approaches. At the moment, if you have to pay back, you pay back all of them and not just the sequestration, even though of course the permanence obligation only applies to sequestration. So it's a bit of a disconnect there that was drafted in. And of course there's sort of assurances that that's not intended, but as per the legislation, that is currently how it works.
Great, thanks Chris. There's another one which anyone on the panel can answer. What's happening with pastoral leases being involved in Savanna burning projects and native title holder approval rights on pastoral land for Savanna burning projects?
Sure, I'll start. So I guess there's always eligible interest holder consent rights over pastoral leases. So it depends on the tenure who those eligible interest holders are, where there are PBCs, so native title holding bodies, those are definitely eligible interest holders. That's then really, I guess, a negotiation in terms of providing that consent. It's really important from an Indigenous perspective, of course, to be consulted early and be true partners in those kinds of projects. So if it is a pastoral leaseholder wanting to run a project, then it's a good idea to talk to the native title holders as early as possible and make sure that everyone's on board, and ultimately that will obviously be beneficial for the project in the longer term, given it has to sort of last the distance and go over the 25 years ahead. So I guess unless there's a sort of specific question, yeah, it's just to say following the EIH guidance there, being conscious of free for consent considerations and making sure that both legal right and eligible interest holder consents are cleared up and are sorted out before the registration of the project.
And just a follow-up question, which I'm not sure if anyone will know, but are many pastoral leases actually doing this yet? It's from Robin Crowley.
I can speak to WA. There might actually be some people on here. There's a couple where that's happening. some of the really early projects up in the North Kimberley, and a couple of others that are pending consent. I'm not sure what it looks like in the NT and Queensland, sorry.
I think we might just have time for one last question, and then we're going to get brought back into the last space. Has anyone got a final question? A question from Alex. In the context of projects that are only viable under the emissions avoidance and sequestration method, could someone share their opinion on the additional risks involved by going down this path?
Kristina, maybe I'll kick off with that one and then your thoughts. But look, I would say the risks associated with that are the risks around sequestration, and certainly probably the biggest one. Well, there's kind of two, is that you need to commit to an ongoing activity of fire management. So if at any period during, well, the current 25-year crediting period, there's a decision is made to discontinue with the project and that fire management will no longer take place, then that's going to have implications for the sequestration credits that have been awarded. So that's probably, like, something that's pretty large to get a proponent to get their head around, is that this is an ongoing commitment to keep doing the fire management activities, otherwise you would have to return those sequestration credits. Then there's a couple of others, but I'll probably say that that's really the most significant one. Kristina, you probably have some thoughts because you've been engaged on the ground in explaining these projects.